name is Sjoerd de Jong, also known as Haurensis, and I started out with game development in 1999 by modding the original Unreal. From Unreal I moved on to modding an tournament. I created 24 standalone levels for that game, as well as several of its biggest mods, Excedia and Operation Apali. In 2003 it was that work that got me into the games industry. I started out with a small job for Streamline Studios, after which I was contracted by Epic Games to work on Anno Tournament 2004 as a level designer. I made 7 of the official levels, including the 2 demo levels Tolan and Rankin. After that contract, I was hired by Guerrilla Games and I worked on Shellshock NAM 67 for a year, and a bit on the first Killzone. I then moved on to Kaon Games, where I worked on the big Unreal Engine 2 MMORPG The Chronicles of Spellborn, while in the meantime I wrote my 2 books, and I took on contracts for Digital Extreme, on the Unreal Engine 2 shooter Warpath, and for WebSen on the Unreal Engine 3 game Huxley. After all that, I was employed by Starbreeze, and I worked on Syndicate for a while, followed by the startup of my own company Theodol Studios. At Theodol Studios, I directed and I worked on our Unreal Engine 3 game The Ball and the UDK game Unmechanical. While working for my own studio, I also took on a contract for Plastic Piranha, as well as for several other smaller clients. Plus all of that aside, I'm also responsible for large bits of Sweden's prime game development indication Future Games nowadays. I wrote my first tutorial sometime around 2002, and have over the years built out my website haurensis.com into a tutorial and training focused site. Unreal Engine 4 wise, I started working with it in March 2013, and I've been working on my own Unreal Engine 4 game Solus ever since. I'm currently also involved in the production of another 2 Unreal Engine 4 games as a consultant. All of that has led that I have 15 years experience in the Unreal Engine, and have done Unreal Engine related work for 17 different companies over the years. Okay, so we're going to begin with death system, damage system, checkpoint and respawn systems. So everything to do with taking damage and respawning. The first thing we need to do is we need to add health to the player. The player right now doesn't track health, so we need to add a health variable to the player, and then we also need to output that health variable to the HUD, so we're able to see how much health the player has. Once we have those things set up, we can then make a basic death system and a basic damage system, followed by more damage effects, things like falling damage and so on. So first things first, we're going to open up the player, so find Solus player. This continues on the first blueprint video, so we have this section in here that's non-standard that was made in the first blueprint tutorial video, and we're going to define a health variable here. So the player has no health right now. Try to look for health, doesn't exist, or actually I made that previously, so you could actually use that one, or you simply make a new variable. The existing one is simply an int. An int is a simple number without decimal point. So either use that one or make a new one, and this will now become the health of the player. You can see the default for me is set to 1000. You can of course set it to whatever you want, but I'm using a 1000 scale for health of the player. To make life easier, let's immediately make sure this gets output to the HUD. So I'm going to go to the HUD. We have Solus HUD over here. We open that one up, and if you zoom out you can see this pre-made part here. You can see this actually starts with the event receive draw HUD. This is what draws the HUD. So everything that should be displayed by the HUD should start from this event. So if we follow this line all the way through, we can see it ends with draw material simple, and this is the crosshair. So the crosshair is just an image of a dot surrounded by a black line. So if we were to then continue this line by adding, let's say, draw text, we can draw a number on the screen. It says here text. I'm temporarily just going to type test just to get going. This will later on be replaced by the actual amount of health you have. Text color, it's black right now, might be a bit hard to see, so I'm going to make it white. And then screen 0, X and Y, this is the position, and this is the size, and also we need a font. So for position, I'm just going to say 6464 and we'll see what gives. That will require tweaking anyway. Then the font, we just need to select some kind of font somewhere. So it just selects anything here. And then let's give that a go and see what happens. So that clearly works. You can see the word test on the top left. It should be noted here that the screen X and Y, that's in units or pixels rather. So it's 64 pixels from the top left corner of the screen. 64 pixels down, 64 pixels to the right. Therefore it shows up somewhere there. Of course that is a problem if the resolution would be changed. Then 64 pixels might suddenly be somewhere here or here or here. I mean, if the number of pixels gets reduced on the screen, the text would also change. And the way I'm solving that myself for example, other things, I don't think I have it in this one over here, but this outputs the resolution X and Y. So if you know the resolution, you can use the resolution of the screen as it is right now and scale the position of whatever you want to draw on the HUD by the current resolution of the screen. Therefore it becomes relative to the resolution. Either way, I'm not going to go that far for this simple setup. This appears to work. We get the text on the screen. So the next step would be to display the actual health on the HUD. The health is a variable on the player called health player. So if I were to be able to get the player in the HUD, and let's say I get player pawn, then I have to cast it because I have to make sure the engine understands that it's this specific type of player, not any type of player, but my player. So I'm casting it to Solus player. And then from Solus player, I can get the health, get player health player. And that one can then be converted to a string and inputted over there. This should now display my health. So let's try that. And it appears to work. I can see 1000. So I can now see how much health I have. I'm actually going to move it a bit to 32. Or now it's underneath Shift F1, the label there. So let me go slightly more down, 48 or so. Well, that probably was the wrong direction. There we go. So with that said, I'm going to save the HUD and return to the player. And then in the player, I need to know when the player takes damage and when the player dies. We can do the damage first, so it's obvious what happens. When you take damage, you should get the glass of your screen should break and blood should appear on your screen as well. So there's two graphical effects for taking damage. We're going to set those up first so it's clear that the health gets reduced. The way that's been set up, and you can look up the particles here, there are two particles, and the two particles get rendered in front of the camera. So if you were to go to player, FX, FX again, then you have player broken glass and player visor blood. This might be difficult to see over here, so I'm going to set it to wireframe and see if I can find it. It doesn't really display well in the and you really have to find the right angle in order to track it. Actually, it might be set to 0 even right now. No, it's not. Try the other one. And actually the raindrops follow the same system. We're not using that right now, but it follows the same system. You can see it here. This is how it works. Again, it's very difficult to see because it's very small and it only shows up on one side. See, on the other side it's invisible. But what happens is that it spawns a lot of particles right in front of the camera. So the camera would be here and this would be spawning in front of it. It's basically just a flat plane attached to the camera. Therefore, if you were to turn the screen, you move the camera, it sticks to the camera. And we actually control the number of particles it spawns. You can see if you press spawn here, this is not a particle tutorial, but if you were to press the spawn module, this controls how many particles get spawned. And here you can see that it's actually, for rate, a particle parameter set to spawn. This is the keyword here, the parameter name. And this basically allows the blueprint to change the number of particles spawned by this particle system. And we're going to be using that system to spawn more particles the more damage you take. So if you take a lot of damage, you will get a lot of blood. If you take a small amount of damage, you only get a little bit of blood. So there's two particles we want to add right now. It's broken glass and it's visor blood. Now we could be adding those two components. We could be going to first person camera and add a particle component here underneath first person camera. And then we can just toggle that one on or off. What I'm going to do instead though, instead of doing that, is I'm going to be spawning that particle in real time during the game. So while having one of the two particles selected, it doesn't really matter which one. I can start with blood probably. I will do add component. Actually, I can just type. I can do add par player visor blood. So by having it selected in the content browser, it will show up in the right click menu. And I can add it here. This now spawns that particle on top of the camera. Well, actually it doesn't spawn it on top of the camera yet, but it spawns it on the player. We can then say that in order for us to easily figure out what it spawns, I'm gonna save this one to a variable. So this is what it spawns. I'm gonna save what it spawned to a variable so I can easily call on it later on. So I'll drag from here and I'll do promote to variable. And I'll call it spawned blood. Apparently that already exists. Spawn blood particle. And then we still need to attach it to the camera, because right now it's spawned on the player, not on the camera. So the next step would be to say attach to component, I believe. Or actually it is not even correct. We should be doing following. I'll drag this one in, so get that, and from there do attach to. This again is a very clear indication of how you can't just right click somewhere and type attach, because you will get something entirely different. See here it says attach actor to actor. Then if you were to drag from here and then type attach, because now you get attach to. I'm gonna move it up a bit more space. So the blood particle gets attached to the camera, first person, get first person camera. That's just the variable on the left here. And it should snap to the target so it instantly gets the same position as the camera. There we go. And then, because we wanted to, the amount of damage you take should be reflected in the amount of blood that appears on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say on this particle, I want to set float parameter. Set float parameter. And this will hook into the particle parameter in the spawn module. So you can see this one, this parameter over here, it's called spawn. I'm going to copy that name. I'm going to say parameter name is spawn. This number now affects this block. The amount it should spawn should be connected to the amount of damage you take. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new variable, and I'm going to call it damage applied, for example, which should be an int. So I'll get that here. And in order to scale it up a bit or scale it down a bit, control it in other words, actually it should first be converted to a float, because this is a float, this is an int. You can see the difference in color. So I'll make this a float to float. Now I have it in float. And then I'll multiply it so I can control the amount a bit. So float by float. like so, and I'm actually going to multiply it by 0.5, so I could have divided it as well. But the point is, since I use a damage scale, and I actually mistyped damage, since I use a damage scale of 1000, the amount of damage that might be applied, might be, for example, 400, and I don't want to be spawning 400 blood particles on the screen. That's too much. So I'm scaling it down, so 400 becomes 200 in order to scale the intensity a bit. So this number represents the intensity, the amount of blood that gets spawned in relation to the amount of damage applied. For the breaking glass, it's the same thing, so you can pretty much actually just nearly copy over the whole thing. Actually, let's just do that. Let's just copy the entire thing, connect it there, but instead of spawning the visor blood, it should spawn broken glass. You can see in the properties here, this is the template it uses. So if I assign broken glass here, it uses that instead. Then spawn blood particle should be, I need a second one for that. So I'm actually just gonna, let's disconnect that and say promote to variable and call it spawned glass particle, like so. And then it should be assigned to that one as well. So I can just drag it on. Make sure you drag on the left side of it. Don't drag on the words. If you drag on the words, it's not going to work. But if you drag the particle, the name of the variable on an existing block in here, and you drag it on the left side of it, next to the text, it will actually replace this one with this one instead. There we go. That one also uses spawn, so it remains the same. Actually, we can even connect this directly there, so it's a little bit cleaner. And actually, let's do this, because I think it might actually need more. After all, let's just keep it at 1, and we can see how much blood it spawns and tweak later on. Right, so this works. This works for when you take damage, but we still don't know when we take damage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a custom event at the beginning called player takes damage. There we go. So now I know, now I can trigger this. For example, I can trigger this from the level blueprint or any other script. From anywhere else I could be triggering this. So let me very quickly set up some kind of damage trigger in the level. I'm going to basics and then box trigger. Okay, so I have a big white trigger here and it's located on this line. So basically if you walk across this line over here in the ground, you should be taking damage. Because I have this thing in here now, I can now call on it from anywhere else. I can call on it from the level blueprint, I can call on it from other blueprints. I can reach this from anywhere. So for example, to demonstrate that, I can open the level blueprint. I have the trigger selected in the viewport. And I can do add event collision on begin overlap. So when you walk into the trigger, then it will take the player or the other actor. The other actor is probably more correct, but since I'm doing a single player game, there is only one player anyway, so might as well just do get player pawn cost to Solus player, so it knows it's the right type. And then I will do, sorry, wrong place to drag from, I should drag from there, player take damage, like so. Let's see if that works. That works. There's not enough blood, but you can see this one glass particle showed up in front of me with broken glass. So it's apparently working, but perhaps not enough. Also, it's not actually working very well because the damage you take, damage applied to player, that's 0. So let's just try to make that 200 for a moment and do this again. So yeah, you can see the effect shows up. The glass doesn't, the blood doesn't show up very clearly, or not at all actually, you can look into that in a bit, but the glass shows up. So that appears to work, but of course we can't be setting the damage. If you look at the level blueprint right now, it simply calls on a damage event, but there is no damage to find. So what we need to do is we need to be able to give this one a certain amount of damage, which then gets translated on towards the player. And the way we can do that is by clicking the custom event in the player, and then on the bottom left you can see input. We can add an input to it. And then you can set that to be an int, and you can call it damage. And you can see if I were to compile this now and now look in the level blueprint, this now has a damage input. So now I can say, okay, you should be doing 400 damage every time you walk through the trigger. So now I have a damage trigger doing 400 damage every time you trigger it. And then in the player, I can say that damage applied to the player, that gets set, and that gets set with the amount of damage that comes in. Like so. And we can look at the blood here. Seems to check what's going on with that one. Let's try to increase this a bit. Actually, in my notes I've wrote down that it's 60, so let's try 60 and see how that holds up. And let's play again. And clearly the blood shows up and the glass breaks. Of course you can keep on walking through the trigger and it gets progressively worse, but I should have been dead by now. The health number still doesn't update though. So let's do that as a next step. In the player, here we do player takes damage. This is the amount of damage applied, etc, etc. So what we can do then is, we can actually do right here in the beginning, is we can get the health of the player. So health player. I can set that, but I should also get it. So both get and set. So I get the health of the player as it is right now, minus the damage applied. So this minus damage applied. Now since this might go under 0, I'm gonna clamp it for safety. So we can say maximum value, maximum health we can have is 1000, minimum is 0. And then that becomes the new health of the player. So let's try this again. I have 1000 health, I walk through the trigger, and I have 600 health. I walk through it again, I have 200 again, and I'm at 0. So now I should be dead. Also, we should be adding some sounds, so we can actually add sounds first before we move on. It's rather soundless right now. There's a number of sounds in the content browser you can add. And sounds, player, gameplay, cue. So when you're dealing with sounds, you got waves and you got cues. A cue is basically like a material and a wave is like a texture. So this is the original source format in the same way that a texture is, well, a texture. And the material takes a texture and adds certain properties on top. In the same way, a cue takes a wave and adds certain properties on top. But it's still the same wave, but it has done more with it. So in here we have a number of things we can use. For example, dead pain. Or let's see if we have something else that's useful. We're looking for something that will sound as if it hurts you. You can play these also. If you right click them and you do play, you can hear them. But do note that you might have to go to quick settings over here and set real-time audio to something not 0. Otherwise you might not hear them. you can actually see that we have a visor break here. This is a breaking glass sound. So I'm going to get that one, and I'm going to get, actually I'm not going to get anything else. I'm just going to stick to that. So visor break, go back to the player blueprint. And if you were to look in components, you can see we have two sounds here. There's two audio components. One is called sound player, the other one is called sound footsteps. You can use either of the two to play sounds on. So I'm going to use sound player to play a visor break sound. So this is a variable because it's a component, therefore it's also automatically a variable. I will get sound player. And then we first need to make sure that the sound player, that this audio component, will play the right sound cue. So step one is I will do set sound. So I set the sound, and the sound I set is this cue we have selected, visor break. That gets connected to that as well. And then we want to make sure this actually plays, so I'll do play sound, or play rather simply. And now we should get a visor break sound every time you take damage. This is probably difficult for you to hear on the video, but it works. Okay, so that's functional. We are now applying damage and tracking the health.